Welcome to the third webinar, which focuses on your policy brief. This webinar is meant to help those who have already submitted a memo in November 2012 and have been invited to participate in the second task of the challenge based on their scores. For all those who are new to the challenge or were not successful this time around, we hope you continue listening on. We have a number of ideas and recommendations that, we hope, will also help strengthen your writing skills. We will cover three things. First, we explain the new task. Second, we will give you advice on what makes a good policy brief. And finally, we will explain the steps for submitting your task. Let's get started. Now, what is the new task? Since you made it to the next stage, you now have to write a policy brief of 1,500 to 1,800 words. You have to do two things specifically. First, we ask you to expand on one specific issue relevant to your scenario. For each scenario, we have posted a new issue that you must address and expand on. You can find them under our website under Challenge Details. Second, we ask you to provide the policy options and recommendations from a partisan perspective. This means that you take on the role, for example, of a representative from the private sector, the think tank world, or from civil society organizations. Remember, do not argue from the government perspective as you did in your policy memo. So, what makes a good policy brief? You can already see that the policy brief for Task 2 is longer than the policy memo in Task 1, and now addresses a variety of policymakers such as government officials or parliamentarians. It is not an internal government-only document, but a public advocacy document designed to influence the decisions of policymakers. You need to keep this target audience in mind. Your policy brief should therefore highlight the urgency of the problem to potentially unaware policymakers, argue for a clear course of action, and finally, provide policy options and recommendations from your chosen perspective. Here's a small checklist for you. First, outline the nature and urgency of the problem of your scenario from your chosen partisan perspective and summarize your key recommendations at the very beginning. Then, include an in-depth discussion on the specific problem now requested for each scenario, taking into account the different views that may exist on the issue. Also, make sure to present different policy options in response to the issue outlined in the scenario and argue for the adoption of what you think is the most appropriate course of action. Then, explain why the proposed course of action is also in the best interest of the government you are addressing. And finally, propose specific and feasible recommendations for your suggested course of action. In addition to the checklist, also recall the 5 elements that made a convincing policy memo. You should apply them to your brief as well. Here are the 5 elements. Your policy brief should be policy and problem-oriented, analysis-driven, offering viable recommendations, evidence-based, and finally, it should also be well-structured and coherent. When you're ready to submit your policy brief, make sure to submit your brief by the deadline on 10th March, midnight your local time. But before doing so, go through the checklist one by one to make sure your policy brief is consistent with the submission guidelines. This means that the length should be between 1,500 and 1,800 words. When you upload your policy brief, it should be uploaded in Word or PDF format in a font no smaller than size 11. Reference your sources using APA citation. If you have questions on the citation, GDPPC website has more on the APA citation style. It is important to cite properly, because failing to do so may lead to plagiarism and, in turn, to disqualification from the challenge. Include a page number and your reference code on each page. Use the code that you received when you registered for the challenge and which you already used to submit your policy memo. Only use this code and do not put your name anywhere on the document. And finally, check for spelling and grammar. Good luck with writing your policy brief. Make sure to check out the policy brief writing guidelines on the GDPPC website before you start writing. Contact us at questions@gdppc.org if you have any questions about the task. And don't forget the submission deadline, 10th of March, 2013.